In the summer of 1969, there seemed to be no limit to what Scott Walker could achieve. With a voice like no other and songwriting to match, he had the world at his feet. He was given his own television series and released 3 albums in just 7 months. However, his third album of that year, now hailed as his best, flopped so badly that it left both his career and personal life in ruins. I'm Andrew from Parlogram, and in this video, I'll explore this album in depth to uncover what went wrong and why Scott 4 is one of my favourite albums of all time. Scott Walker was one of the most talented musical artists of the 20th century. However, despite his remarkable talents and golden voice, fame troubled him, and he remained a deeply private person.
Hold her and show her you care.
I remember hearing Scott Walker's voice long before I heard the Beatles. It was on a song called Love Her by his group the Walker Brothers, which my father had recorded on his reel-to-reel tape recorder. I distinctly recall hearing Scott's deep, ethereal voice echoing from that machine's speaker. Growing up, I quickly became familiar with the Walker Brothers' hits, but knew nothing of Scott's solo work. And that wasn't surprising because most of it was deleted in the early 1970s, and trying to find original copies was difficult and expensive. The first man to put his money where his mouth was Julian Cope, who released this modestly titled compilation, Fire Escape in the Sky, The Godlike Genius of Scott Walker, on the independent Zoo Records label in August 1981. Although it sold very few copies, it awakened the sleeping giant, and a few months later, Scott Walker's record company, Phonogram, who by this time owned the original Philips Masters, released a collection of his Jacques Brel covers called Scott Walker Sings Jacques Brel. With the explosion of CD sales in the late 1980s, the big record companies quickly realized that they were sitting on a fortune, and with renewed interest in his work, Phonogram decided to put together a compilation of his solo work themselves. I don't know about you, but I remember exactly where I bought every record and CD I own, and I came across this CD in Whiteley's in Bayswater, London, shortly after it was released in 1990. Although I didn't recognise any of the tracks on it, Mark Arman's sleeve notes convinced me to take a chance. Boy Child contains 20 tracks selected from Scott's 5 solo albums, released between 1967 and 1970. Scott 1, Scott 2, Scott 3, Scott 4, and Till the Band Comes In. It also included a track called The Plague, which was the B-side to his first solo single. I remember listening to this CD's first track, which was The Plague, and it disappointed me. However, what I heard next floored me. And by the time the CD had ended, I was in another world. But I wanted more. To Phonogram's surprise, Boy Child sold 8,000 copies, which was unheard of for an archive compilation at that time. They followed it up with the underrated After the Lights Go Out, a compilation that included some of the Walker Brothers' best songs, and some of Scott's best solo performances with the group. This in turn led to a successful TV advertised compilation called No Regrets in January 1992. Then, slowly, one by one, starting in March 1992, Scott's solo albums began to appear in the shops once more.
1969!
As I mentioned at the top of this video, 1969 was a busy year for Scott Walker. In March, he released his third solo album, Scott 3, a mix of incredible self-penned songs with 3 Jacques Brel covers tacked on the end. In June, Philips released Scott Walker Sings Hits from his TV series, a collection of 12 popular standards he covered on his successful, yet unfortunately wiped, BBC television show. These two albums perfectly illustrate Scott's dilemma. He wanted to create intelligent records, but realised that many of those would not be commercially successful. However, he needed to be commercial to attract an audience that might eventually be willing to listen to more intelligent records. Naturally, his record label was eager for him to produce more middle-of-the-road songs and pushed him into the recording studio to make a follow-up to his top 10 hit from the previous year, Joanna, called The Lights of Cincinnati. Walker disliked both songs intensely, but qualified his decision to record them by saying, "I gotta eat and pay the rent." Scott had a deep respect for jazz musicians and at around that time embarked on his first role as producer for the debut album of Australian alto saxophonist Ray Worley. Released in September 1969, the album disappeared without trace. However, Worley went on to collaborate with many famous artists, including Nick Drake. In fact, Worley plays the flute on Sunday, the final track on Nick Drake's second album, Brighter Later. But that's a story for another day. Scott's relationship with his manager, Maurice King, had always been strained, and like most of that era, was both artistically and financially complex. However, to be fair, managing Scott can't have been easy. Matters came to a head in Blackpool on July 27, 1969, when Scott, who admitted to his excessive drinking, reportedly performed on stage while intoxicated. The consequences of this became overwhelming for King, leading him and Scott to part ways. Despite the absence of a manager, Scott's stock was still high at Philips, and they gave him carte blanche to write, record and release his fourth solo album. As Philips recording studios were being refitted, the sessions for Scott 4 took place at Olympic Sound Studios in Barnes in southwest London, the same studio that was used that year by the Stones and Led Zeppelin. Keith Roberts joined forces with trusted and experienced arrangers Peter Knight and Wally Stott. Talented engineers Keith Grant and Adrian Kerridge handled the mixing desk, and with Scott's great friend Johnny Franz in the producer's chair, the stage was set for something special. So let's now go through this album track by track and find out the stories behind the songs. The album kicks off in spectacular style with The Seventh Seal. The song reflects Scott's interpretation of Ingmar Bergman's 1957 masterpiece, set in Sweden during the medieval period amidst the Black Death. Bergman's film portrays the journey of a medieval knight and the game of chess he plays with the personification of death, who's come to take his life. The track's apocalyptic arrangement and driving rhythm capture the feeling of the song perfectly, setting the scene for the brilliance that is to come. Scott had an incredible talent for writing lyrics that expressed the feelings of loss and all of its accompanying emotions. On track 2, he's at his poetic best. Lasting just 90 seconds, On Your Own Again reflects on a brief yet intense relationship that has recently ended. In the lyrics, he reminisces about the euphoria it brought to his life and attempts to convince himself that despite being on his own again, he's at his best again. It's such a simple song, and like many of Scott's other best works, it's clever, relatable, and profoundly sad. The World's Strongest Man is another fantastic track. Arranged by Keith Roberts, who was working with Scott for the first time, it introduces an essential element absent from Scott's other 3 solo albums: rhythm. This song's gentle rhythm, combined with a beautiful melody and strong yet vulnerable lyrics, makes this another unskippable track. In fact, Scott 4 is for me one of those rare albums where every track is essential.
The angels of ashes will give back your passions again.
Angels of Ashes is an exquisite poem set to music, and at 4 minutes 21 seconds is the longest track on the album. Building on a beautiful yet simple circular melody of acoustic guitar and bass, The song's emotions unfold as it progresses, incorporating harpsichord and ultimately a full orchestra, conducted by Peter Knight, which is transcendent in its own right. It's such a difficult song to put into words, so please listen to it for yourself and tell me in the comments what you think about it. Backed by Wally Stott's haunting arrangement, Boy Child retraces the singer's steps to childhood. The lyrics of this song are profound, and similar to Angels of Ashes, the arrangement evokes the feeling of floating in the sky on a sunny day, gazing down at the world. It's an incredible track. Scott had written a moving song about two First World War veterans in the song Two Ragged Soldiers on his previous album Scott 3. The song, which opens up side 2 of Scott 4, follows a similar theme. Hero of the War is a cynical song about the homecoming of a wounded soldier from Vietnam and the reaction of the people in his neighborhood to that event. Scott's split with Maurice King had liberated him from his pop star responsibilities, allowing him to sing about whatever he wanted on this album, and he wasn't afraid to get political.
See Evening News with Frank Reynolds. Evening. Once again, the Soviet Union, demonstrating a colossal contempt for the opinion of mankind, has resorted to brute force to keep a satellite nation under control. Russian tanks and infantry, aided by troops from East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Bulgaria, have occupied Czechoslovakia and have crushed the new and relatively liberal leadership of that small country.
Footage of tanks thundering through the streets of Prague was broadcast worldwide. And whilst the media coverage at the time was quick and critical, many, including Scott, were frustrated by Western governments' inaction regarding the Czechs' plight. And it was those events which inspired Scott to write what I think is this album's best track. The Old Man's Back Again, dedicated to the neo-Stalinist regime, is a stinging denunciation of the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and is a song which could have been written today. I love the arrangement of this track, which, when its elements are analysed, reveal its true genius. At its heart is a sublime drum pattern from a stereo-mic'd kit. That's complemented by one of the best-sounding and most complex bass lines ever. Then there's a touch of simple rhythm guitar. And with Scott's vocals layered on top, you have one of the best-sounding tracks from the 1960s.
A shadow across the sky.
The orchestra and choir may be a bit over the top, but they don't detract from how amazing this song is. Now, many articles and videos about this song incorrectly credit the bass player as being the late Herbie Flowers, and whilst he did play on this album, the bassist on this track was the most famous unknown bass player, Dave Richmond. Here he is at Olympic with the rhythm guitarist and Scott, perhaps discussing this very track. Richmond's bass guitar of choice was a Burns Bison, but the secret to his signature sound was its black Rotosound 88 true bass strings, the same ones Paul McCartney used on the rooftop in Let It Be. Richmond's playing can also be heard on Serge Gainsborough's Je T'aime single, and throughout his 1971 album Histoire de Melody Nelson. If you'd like to hear more examples of Dave Richmond's wonderful bass playing, there's a link in the description to a YouTube channel called The Sound of Dave Richmond. It features videos of a faceless yet very talented musician playing along to some of Richmond's best-known tracks. The album's next track is a complete change of tempo and a rarity in Scott's solo catalogue. Duchess is a beautiful country-tinged love song, inspired by an album Scott pronounced the best pop album he'd ever heard. The album that inspired him was this one by Dion. As the Russians were invading Czechoslovakia, Dion DiMucci was in Florida coming off heroin and preparing to live life sober for the first time in years. Abraham, Martin and John is a song written by Dick Holler, which commemorates the lives of Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, and John F. Kennedy. Dion sings this simple but beautiful song perfectly, in a voice so full of sadness and regret that it's easy to see why Scott was so impressed. However, I believe it's this album's second track which inspired Duchess, which is a slow cover of Jimi Hendrix's Purple Haze. Unfortunately, I can't play much of it in this video, but I'll include a link in the description so you can let me know what you think about it in the comments. Like Duchess, the album's penultimate track, Get Behind Me, was arranged by Keith Roberts, and as a result, is probably as close as Scott would come to contemporary musical styles. It's another magnificent arrangement, with a touch of Nashville guitars and another wonderful bass part. Some have interpreted the album's final track, The Rhymes of Goodbye, as Scott saying goodbye, which, in a way, it was. Scott 4 was released on November 1st, 1969, and like his previous two solo albums, came in a stylish gatefold cover. However, this time it was credited under his real name, Scott Engel. The album's sales were an unmitigated disaster. In addition to confusing customers with the name change, Philips declined to promote it. Reviews in the music press were mixed at best, and fans who had known him since the Walker Brothers days just didn't get it. It was then, along with the rest of Scott's solo albums, quickly deleted. Unsurprisingly, his fans' and record companies' rejection deeply affected Scott, and after one more half-hearted attempt at creative writing the following year on his next album, Till the Band Comes In, he pretty much abandoned writing original material for the rest of the decade. For me, this is one of the most essential albums in my collection, but if you're looking to purchase a copy for yours, what are your options? Should you go vintage or new? I'm fortunate to own an original 1969 test pressing, which I compare to all others. The standard 1969 Philips pressing is exceptional. The original cassette, less so. It does, however, differ from the vinyl in one way. Because of timing differences, Boychild and Duchess are switched. The album was finally re-released in August 1992 on CD and cassette only. That was followed in 2000 by an HD CD issue. That edition fixes the tape slip at the beginning of World's Strongest Man, but is otherwise identical to the 1992 edition. In 2008, it was reissued by a label called Four Men with Beards, which should be avoided at all costs. The regular vinyl edition that is available now is satisfactory and easy to find. However, if you want to treat yourself, I highly recommend Miles Scholl's outstanding half-speed master edition, which was cut from the original analog tapes, and also corrects the tape slip on World's Strongest Man. For me, Scott 4 is the pinnacle of his solo career, and while I respect the work he did after, nothing tops the music he made between 1967 and 1970. Like many artists, Scott was only interested in looking forward and hated listening to his back catalogue, which I understood but found sad. However, in 2017, 2 years before he passed away, he got to see and, according to those present, enjoy other artists interpreting his songs at a concert at the Royal Albert Hall. I know Scott's music isn't everyone's cup of tea, but I hope you found this video interesting and entertaining, and that you'll consider giving Scott 4 a listen. If you'd like to dig a little deeper into his 60s solo work on vinyl, this expanded edition of Boychild, released on Record Store Day in 2022, is a great starting point. I'll leave the last word to Albert Camus, who Scott quoted on the back of the Scott 4 album cover, which I think encapsulates the feelings of every artist. Thanks for watching. A man's work is nothing but this slow trek to rediscover through the detours of art those 2 or 3 great and simple images in whose presence his heart first opened.